I'm so sorry that I was forced to miss the whole rest of this day. I literally just got here 2 minutes ago because we were, well, I'm sorry because I don't actually like doing that. I like being at the full conference and actually seeing context, and particularly wanted to see the high-speed rail debate as a member of the administration. And actually, as a planner, I'm very glad that the pro team won that debate, I hear. So yay, high-speed rail. Happy to debate that with any of you at any time. But where I was, as Marianne said, I was chairing a Strategic Growth Council meeting where we awarded $400 million in grants to housing, affordable housing that is directly connected to transit and to sustainable community sort of policies. So transit, urban greening, walkability, bikeability, and across California and across very urban to very rural areas. And rural areas including sort of farm worker-focused van pools as the transit option. So it was very inspiring morning. However, it forced me to have to drive here from Sacramento, which I do not recommend that drive ever to anyone under any circumstances. It's so nice to be here at Stanford. I am a Cal Bear, but I have a lot of Stanford connections, and I know. Thank you, go Bears. But I am thrilled to be down here, and it's just, I end up speaking at Stanford more than at Berkeley, I think, because you have such great energy programs. Sally Benson, I see in the front row, is a great leader on those. And it's a school that does a great job in integrating, I think, private sector and public sector action on climate and energy, which is not an easy thing to do. So, so thank you to Marianne, thank you to everybody for inviting me, and thank you to Stanford for being a leader on these issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm definitely going to leave a lot of time for Q&A because that's always my favorite part of all talks. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the governor's ambitions when it comes to climate and sort of how his approach is a real shift from Governor Brown's approach. I think it continues the ambition, but it's a real shift in approach. I should say, as you heard, I'm both the head of the Office of Planning and Research, which has the mandate of doing long-range planning for the state of California for the governor and the cabinet, which can mean a lot of different things. But in large part means we look at things that touch land use. And given that this is California, most things touch land use in one way or another. Housing, transportation, climate resilience, renewable energy siting, military bases. So many things that touch land use. I also am the governor's senior advisor on climate change, and so I have the responsibility for kind of taking the big picture overview look at how the administration is thinking about climate and how we're integrating across a number of different agencies and programs, and which in the last 6 months has been quite a daunting task. But in that role, I get to think a lot about sort of how the governor's thinking about climate change, and he's a real leader on it. So I'm excited to talk about that. And then I'll dive in a little bit on some specific areas we're focusing on, looking forward, and then we'll do questions. So we're obviously following an incredibly ambitious and kind of vocal climate leader in Governor Brown, who, you know, we like to say in the Newsom administration that we're moving from ambition to action. And the ambition set by Governor Brown is really mind-boggling if you think about it. You know, a 50% renewable power by 2030, the SB 100 goals, which was, of course, the legislature of setting 100% clean energy, the goals of 5 million electric vehicles, the carbon neutrality by 2045. Governor Brown set this incredible ambition, and it was really a particularly important. He also extended the cap and trade program to 2030, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Those goals have been incredibly important in setting a framework for California under which we all, public sector, private sector, act. But also, I think it's really important to think about the world kind of pre-Paris Agreement and post-Paris Agreement. Governor Brown played an incredibly important role as a head of a subnational, so not at the table on the UN negotiations, but somebody who had an enormous amount of influence on the table. He played a really important role, and I think other subnationals and businesses did too, in making that happen, in getting it so that nations could sit down at that table and make that agreement. So I think that is critically important. Now, what happened at that table was, of course, a global framework for ambition, and the framework that required now national actors to actually meet that ambition. So we have moved, I think, globally and in California from ambition to action. Governor Newsom is in a position where he has, again, these incredible goals that have been set for the state. how to accomplish those goals and how to do it in a way that, as he says, provides solutions for all Californians. California for all is a real rallying cry for this administration. How do we think about a sustainable, inclusive economy that gives benefits broadly across California, not just to the most heavily legislatively representative parts of California, but all of California, and really focuses in on where people are feeling these impacts every day. So Governor Newsom has articulated that in a number of ways. He's narrowed in on a couple of places that I'll talk a little bit more about, but I do think budgets are where people's priorities become real. And I think if you look at the budget that has just been put forward, you'll see with the legislature, you'll see a real focus on, again, kind of disadvantaged communities, or I like to say underserved communities. I always feel like disadvantaged communities makes it sound like communities that will always be disadvantaged, which is not, I think, a great way to frame the issue. But underserved communities, human scale impacts from particularly air and water. And then you'll also see a real focus on integrating climate change throughout all of these other policy areas, particularly housing. So two areas that the governor has really focused in on, kind of with a laser focus, and it's partly not a choice. They're both about crises, right? One is a real focus on wildfires and the impact of the wildfires, and the PG&E bankruptcy, and the ratings agency downgrades, and all the things that came after the wildfires. I know you had a session on that earlier today. And the other is really on the housing affordability crisis. So two things that are actually both very land use focused and very much kind of at a crisis point in the state, and have both of those are really reflected in the budget. I should say the budget includes an enormous amount of funding for emergency preparedness, response, and recovery, including a fair amount of work around integrating climate resilience into that recovery and planning, and also a $1.75 billion proposal on housing that I'll talk a bit more later. So the fires have been very mind-focusing, and I just want to put the fires in the context of climate change, because I think it's interesting. I'm friends with a lot of people in the climate community, not surprisingly, and also within the government, who say to me, oh, now that you've put out all this stuff on the fires, now you can think about climate change. And I always want to say, so the fires are releasing a lot of carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and that's actually, there's a bill right now in the legislature that would require us to count that as part of our emissions. We don't right now. And B, the fires are incredibly important from sort of a land use perspective, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Thank you. About that later. And then C, the fires are important from a forest management perspective, which has a carbon sequestration benefit. So there's a lot of climate issues around the fires, but the fires have focused the attention. Essentially, I think about the fires as sort of a three-part, there's three things coming together in California. And I know Ralph Cavanagh knows this, and I see him there. We talked about this a lot. One is climate change is making fires more severe and more frequent. We have, as you all know, especially the climate scientists in the room, it's not one thing or the other. It's increasing periods of precipitation and drought. You've got what we just had, which is a very wet winter. Whole lot of vegetation grows, dries out as it gets hot and windy, becomes essentially just tinder, right? So that's a thing that's happening and increasing. Coming in from the side, population growth. We're looking at 50 million people in California by 2050. An enormous amount of growth has happened outside of our urban areas and is going further and further into what we call the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. It's a terrible acronym. 11 million Californians live in the WUI right now, and 2.5 live in the severe risk areas. Third is the fact that we require utilities to serve those people when they move into the WUI, and then we have this very complicated utility liability situation, which I'm not going to talk about a ton, but I'm happy to answer questions about. So those three things come together, really, really increase the threat. And what's interesting to me, I did a lot of work, as you heard before this job, on this question of what is the actual economic impact of climate risk and how does it affect pricing. You know, we think about it as this very esoteric issue. Climate change, it's way up there, it's way far away. These impacts have real economic implications, and we just saw this happen, right? We just saw increased risk leads to, in part, utilities being unable to deal with their liability and costs, leads to a bankruptcy, leads in part to the ratings agencies downgrading them and the other two big IOUs. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, climate change does have a cost. And so everyone starts focusing in on what do we do about that. And I think that's only the beginning of what we're going to see in this space. We're going to see that kind of cost, internalization of cost across a number of things. And California is blessed in our geography, but also cursed in that we have every climate impact you can think of. I mean, we have fires, floods, sea level rise, extreme heat. We actually have glaciers, right? We have sort of everything. And so all of those things are going to be places that we need to pay attention as that cost issue comes in. So the PG&E bankruptcy was like on the first week of the governor's term, and my office has been deeply involved in this set of issues around that intersection, as I just said, of population, fire, and utilities. The Senate last year passed a bill at the end of the fire season last year called SB 901, which tried to kind of do a short-term fix of how do we deal with this liability issue. It set up a catastrophic wildfire commission that was appointed across the governor and the legislature to try to address these cost recovery issues. And it also put into place some sort of short-term measures. And I think Michael Wara is here somewhere. Michael Wara was a member of the commission, incredibly helpful in helping us think this through. My office staffed the commission. So we had the Catastrophic Wildfire Commission. We were part of the governor's second executive order was one asking CAL FIRE to do a short-term analysis of the top most vulnerable communities in California and a short-term approach to how to address those, to prioritize resources toward those communities before the 2019 fire season. We were involved in that report, looking at longer-term methodology on risk. And then I was also a member of the governor's energy strike force, which has helped try to think these issues through the governor's office. So we've been through fire all the time, essentially. And I think there's some outcomes there, and there's some things that are still up in the air. You do see a lot of focus in the budget on wildfire risk reduction, in particular through fire management, home hardening, and other fire practices. You do see a lot of focus on, increasingly, we're thinking a lot about fire prediction. So models that can look a little bit more, whether satellite data or other data, at thinking about how close vegetation is to houses and how we plan better. And then we're starting to see a lot more focus on climate resilience as a kind of a more central issue. I mean, I have Department of Finance and Treasury now talking to me about climate risk, whereas it used to be all Calif and the resources, which I think is a real sea change. So proof is sort of hits the ground here on climate risk as a financial thing. The commission I just talked about, the Commission on Catastrophic Wildfire Cost and Recovery just gave its recommendations this week to the governor and the legislature on a range of things, from liability to insurance to a little bit on fire management. I will say that the commission wasn't supposed to look at risk reduction, but there's no way you can do this issue and not think about risk reduction. It's the single most important thing. So they addressed it, and they came up with a set of recommendations that very briefly essentially says we need to strengthen the way that the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, decides whether utilities are responsible or not, the prudent manager standard. We need to really look at whether we should change the inverse condemnation rules on utility liability. We need to establish a wildfire victims fund to pay outs for actual damages and claims. They recommend creating an electric utility wildfire board separate from the PUC. And then there's an enormous amount of recommendations that I highly recommend on insurance that are about keeping a risk-based standard in California. And this is just a really important underlying issue of how do we make sure we're not subsidizing risk through subsidizing sort of these continued practices of people continuing to move into these areas and continuing to, frankly, not necessarily do what they need to do to harden their homes. So there is a homeowner responsibility here. Why is that piece, that behavior piece, so important, insurance piece so important? I think it's really important because it's the big connection to land use, right? So the other big area, we've got fires increasing our emissions over here. California is a leader, right? Jerry Brown made us a leader. We are a leader. We're doing incredibly well. I could talk for an hour about how well we're doing. Where our emissions are going up, wildfires is one area, transportation is another. So if you look at transportation with oil and gas extraction and refining incorporated into the transportation sector, it's 51% of our carbon emissions in this state, and it is increasing. It is the area that is increasing. It's not holding steady like agriculture and industry are. It's not going down like electricity production is. It's going up. Why is it going up? It's going up primarily because people are driving a lot. People are driving a lot. They're continuing to drive a lot. They're driving alone. That big dip in driving is, of course, the recession. And then everybody started driving again. One of the really challenging things about economic growth is it comes with a lot of driving, especially if you have a housing crisis and no one's building housing and everyone has to move further and further away. So we have this situation where we've got the fire issue is partly an affordability issue, which means that the transportation emissions issue is an affordability issue. And all of these things kind of come together around what we call VMT, or vehicles miles traveled. My office is kind of like a laser focused on this issue because it's an area we have got to do better. I think one of the things that characterized the Brown administration and why we made so much progress, I mean, I'm 100% in favor of what he did on this, but his administration was very focused on technology. So really, really good goals and strides on like electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles. And we're continuing to do that work. We're continuing to fund those programs. But the Air Resources Board came out with a great study last December, which kind of took a hard look at, are we achieving our goals on sustainable communities and where aren't we making the progress we made on emissions? And they found exactly, I mean, these are all their slides, right? But what they found was that even if we have a 10-fold increase in electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles in this state, we have to go down by 25% in vehicle miles traveled to meet our goals. It is not just about replacing every one of those cars with another car that's zero emission. It's an issue of accessibility, of health, of safety, of quality of life, of people not moving into really high-risk areas of the state. There are all kinds of reasons that is incredibly important, and frankly, of economic development, because people are losing recruits because of this problem. So it is not just a technology fix. This is really a larger issue for the state. So in their report that came out, they basically said California will not achieve the necessary greenhouse gas emission reductions to meet mandates for 2030 and beyond without significant changes to how communities and transportation systems are planned, funded, and built. And that is my office's major focus and has been for a long time. The Office of Planning and Research came into existence in 1970. And in 1978, there was this famous document called the Urban Strategy, which was the last time that the state had a state-level approach and vision to land use planning in the state of California. We're a very local control state. And so that's a really interesting question, is sort of not that exact thing, but how do we start rethinking what the state's role is, given that we have state priorities around climate and we have a responsibility as a government that's fiscally responsible to not increase our own risk and liability through the way we do land use. What is our state role there? And that's something we struggle with and think about every day. Governor Newsom is incredibly focused on this and on the relationship between transportation and housing, and of course his recommitment to high-speed rail, but not just high-speed rail connected to a regional rail system around the state, and high-speed rail with a focus on rail stations that are centrally located, and the ability to be hubs for dense economic development in the Central Valley is incredibly important. Old era of planning, right? We did Highway 5, which is a classic kind of older era of planning in that it bypasses every single city in the Central Valley. So you can go from here to LA without ever stopping in one of the major cities of the Central Valley. That has starved those cities of a fair amount of development and opportunity. And so one of the ideas around high-speed rail as an anchor tenet of the Valley is basically to sort of have a more sustainable and inclusive approach to that set of areas. This is a project, Lenny Mendoza, who I don't know if he's still here, but if he is, he is great. He and I get to work together on this Central Valley and Inland Empire Regions Rise Together project. And so we're very excited about that. So all of this is very related to housing. There's not enough housing. You guys hear about this every day because it's constantly in the news. It's actually kind of nice for me, as a planner, to have housing back in the news. It hasn't been in a long time. It's the numbers are staggering of how unaffordable it is here. You all know this, I'm sure, from personal experience and from trying to recruit people to work at Stanford. So it's very challenging, or your companies. It's a very, very challenging problem. 80% of the housing in California is single family homes. So we just have a land use pattern that challenges us, right? I mean, it's a very sprawly single family home built up environment. And there's a lot of it's a very challenging culture shift to move away from that, but we're starting to kind of get to that inflection point, again, both from a climate perspective and from a affordability and just equity perspective. There's a huge linkage between housing and transportation. I always say you can't talk about affordable housing without talking about transportation. Housing is the biggest single portion of any Californian's budget, but transportation is the second. And so if you are spending less on housing, but you're driving 2 hours a day from Los Banos to here, for instance, which a lot of people do, 80,000 people a day drive across the Altamont Pass from the Central Valley into the Bay Area to work. So if you have that situation, think about what you're spending on the driving side in terms of time, in terms of your vehicle, wear and tear. Think about the externalized cost of the air pollution from that. I mean, there's all kinds of costs embedded in that we don't think about, but it is an incredibly important part of the affordability conversation. When people can afford to live near jobs and services and transit if possible, or walking and biking opportunities, it has huge benefits, both measurable and immeasurable. So we're thinking a lot about that. One of the things the governor did in this budget that I just think is really important to look at as a climate thing, and not just a housing thing, or not merely a housing thing, is you may remember in January he made a big speech. I'm going to put $500 million into housing, like into helping local governments build housing. And there was a huge amount of media around it because he said, we're going to tie it to transportation dollars, and everyone freaked out. What he did in the May revision of the budget and his standing in the budget is that he put that $500 million, he took it out of a general housing area and he put it specifically into infill infrastructure grants. So what he's doing is helping cities build up the infrastructure underneath infill development, which is hard for cities to finance, specifically to make this point that it isn't just about housing wherever, whenever. It's about a way of developing sustainably, and it's centrally a climate issue. So why do we care about VMT? I mean, I think this is sort of obvious, but I'll talk about it because, I mean, I just drove 2.5 hours from Sacramento, and, not that that's my commute, but that is some people's commute, and it was truly awful. And so why do we care about it? It's a quality of life issue. I mean, first of all, traffic fatalities, right? I mean, more cars on the road for longer, it is unsafe. Yes, autonomous vehicles could dramatically reduce this. Yes, I hear you, AV people, but this is a current issue. People in California, our obesity numbers are starting to go up again across California. There's been a number of studies tying that specifically to the amount of time people are spending in their cars. So just the more ability to get out of your car, right? I mean, this isn't an EV versus non-EV question. This is a how much time are you in your car question. And just walkability, more better housing options, giving people more options to live in more types of places is an equity issue and a quality of life issue. So we think a lot about transit-oriented development. And finally, just, to me, the flip side of infill development is conservation. So the more you densify in your built environment, the more you can preserve valuable agricultural land, valuable conservation land, the more you can have green spaces that interestingly tie us back to fire. Some of the fires that just happened last year were actually stopped from spreading and stopped just before they hit a number of residential communities by orchards and other agricultural land, which works as a fire break. So this is, again, this integral connection between these things. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes because I know you're an energy crowd, and I just made you become a housing crowd, which is always a little hard, but I'm on a mission. A little bit about what we have been able to do. I mean, on the reducing VMT side, we and others have done a couple of really important things on this. The places interesting that have been the biggest success stories on reducing VMT in America are Minneapolis and Seattle. Both have reduced, there are only 2 cities in the United States that have reduced VMT in the last 5 years, both by prioritizing infill development, prioritizing transit, and prioritizing conservation on the outside of those urban areas. And Minneapolis is actually, I don't know if you read about this in the New York Times, they did a very radical thing, which is that they banned single-family zoning from the entire city of Minneapolis, which would not go over well in most cities here, but that's what they did. And I'm from the Midwest, like they're not usually that radical, so that was a big deal. We also know that people have done really interesting transit strategies. I actually really like to look at West Sacramento, which did a pilot project to reduce it's not a particularly dense place if you've been there. It's sort of like suburban, a little lower income. They took their bus system and did a pilot project to replace all their buses with on-demand van pools. and had ridership go way up, interestingly, mostly among teenagers and seniors, which I sort of love the idea of those groups like hanging out together on van pools. And now they're thinking about replacing the entire system, because we do see transit ridership going down across California in almost every jurisdiction. So part of this is going to have to be innovative approaches, right, to both housing and transportation. So looking ahead on the vehicle side again for you energy crowd, I mean, one of the other major strategy on transportation is, of course, the zero emission vehicle strategy. We have very strong goals on this, a really strong commitment, and you'll see this in the budget for sure, not only to the rebate program for EVs, but also to, I think, a really important and often overlooked program, the Enhanced Vehicle Retirement Program, which actually helps people retire old vehicles and replace them with cleaner vehicles. So this EV thing can't just be a bunch more EVs. We have 26 million cars on the road in California right now. You want to add another 5 million EVs on top of that? Or do we want people to replace? We want fleet replacement, right? So to get fleet replacement, one of the best ways to do that is to actually ask people to retire a vehicle when they get their EV rebate, which we are doing in one program in Air Resources Board, with increased amounts for lower income folks and increased amounts for cleaner replacements. Autonomous vehicles, we've all heard the heaven and hell scenario. If you know Dan Sperling and Davis, he loves to talk about this. I love these guys playing dominoes in there. I just love this picture. Like we could have, again, every one of those vehicles, the 26 million, replaced by an autonomous vehicle that then never parks and just circles around endlessly, and then it becomes this like nightmare scenario. Or you could look at things like what's happened in West Sacramento. If those van pools were autonomous, it would be like a whole kind of more efficient and an exciting system, particularly interestingly in rural areas. The state has actually developed a set of AV principles that really focus on that question of, if we're going to do autonomous vehicles at scale, they need to be shared, they need to be pooled, they need to be the right size and part of a larger multimodal system, and not just kind of thrown haphazardly in as a replacement for the current system. It's an acknowledgement that the current system is failing for us to reach our climate goals and frankly our just sustainability and equity goals, and that we need to change. Just a couple more quick things. She took away my second to last slide. Well, I'll say a couple more quick things about my office. One thing that we do, so very specifically in this space, we do general plan guidelines. We do CEQA guidelines, which is everybody's favorite thing that we do. And then we also run the integrated climate adaptation. We run the Climate Adaptation Clearinghouse, which is a place where you can actually see all of the work that the state's doing on resilience and on adaptation across the state. And we tie it very explicitly to land use, including with maps that are done really that do some of these overlays of the different risks. So you can look, if you're starting to think about, okay, I buy it, like we need to be more dense and we need to build some more stuff, and where should we be doing that? We can overlay fire risk, flood risk, and then look at individual parcels and what they're zoned for, and actually figure out what that should look like going into the future. So it's a discussion based in fact, and not just based in theory. So I think that, at the end of the day, I know what you're hearing from me is that we're very committed to our goals. We're very committed to achieving them, but we're committed to achieving them not over here in a silo that's sort of laser focused on sort of just technology solutions, although they're a huge part of the puzzle. We're focused on addressing them through every other policy that we do, whether it's housing, whether it's health, whether it's transportation, that climate and climate risk and climate opportunity have to underlie every one of those decisions. And that's, I think, really what makes the governor kind of special in some ways in this. He's a very integrated thinker. And so he really takes this high level approach and thinks about how do we think across all these areas of importance to California to move forward to kind of a more sustainable future. So it's very exciting, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I just have before I'm going to ask Kate a couple of questions, but before I have a question for the audience. How many people took public transit to get here today?
Yay!
All right. How many people walked? How many people rode their bikes? How many people carpooled? How many people drove solo cars here? How
many were electric cars, just in case?
Okay, yeah. How many electric cars?
Okay,
great.
just so we know.
How many people need to charge their car before they can go home? Mm-hmm. And were you able to hook up with charging? All right, good. Okay. So the reason I asked that is you made a comment about systemic change. And somebody during the high-speed rail debate talked about in a totalitarian country, it's a little bit easier because if the management of or the leadership of the country cares about climate or energy goals, they can just declare we are going to do this and put the resources in. And I'm sure there's complicated politics behind the scenes, but they can move things forward a little bit faster. But we live in a region that's a committee of committees and everybody does their own thing. We have 28 transit agencies in the Bay Area. We have private companies like Google that run the 7th largest transit area agency in the Bay Area. They don't interoperate well. And so for those of us who drive solo cars, if we want to make that switch, riding your bike on El Camino is very risky, for example. So the transformation of the system is hard. And I just have a kind of a statement that everyone in the room who's in any institutions, if you have money invested in anything, if you are a customer, if you're a citizen, if you're a leader, a researcher, or a corporate executive, or an investor, or an entrepreneur, or a nonprofit leader, everybody has a role to play in transforming the system, but we kind of have to figure out how to do it like termites building a termite mound or bees building their beehive. There's not necessarily one in charge.
I would say that's true. There's not one, we don't have one regional system, right? That we do have regional metropolitan planning organizations, but they only have limited power and they have to work with others. Two things I'm going to say on this. One is these are profoundly local decisions. And I just really urge, I think this has not been clear enough and it's getting clearer and clearer with the numbers. If we don't figure out this land use and housing and transportation problem, we will not solve our climate problem. We will not meet our climate goals in the state of California. We are going backward on this issue. And so you do have power at the local level, honestly. Local council members are who make the majority of these decisions. And so they're very, very important to engage with. And we have not engaged with them on this issue to a great extent. But the other thing I'll say is that I think we're in an era where this has become a regional problem in a way that it wasn't really before. The commute sheds or commute areas of most of these cities or of Google or of Facebook are not confined to metropolitan areas. They're profoundly regional. So all of these jurisdictions are having to work together because they're having to coordinate how those people all get to a job center. The wildfires are inherently regional. They're not something any jurisdiction can control, but everybody wants to limit their risk, right? And then in terms of what we can do at the state level, one of the reasons that high-speed rail is exciting is that it is a state project. And so it's sort of an opportunity for us to think, how do we engage on this regional project and think about how to do it right, and kind of use it as a model.
And I want to pick up on the climate risk. I organized an event about climate risk and insurance, and it was really hard to get the insurance companies to come. And at the time, Dave Jones was insurance commissioner, and he had thought going into that office that he could have a nice lever. But then it turns out that the companies that are not reinsurance companies make their decisions on every year.
Annual basis.
And so they're not really that motivated to think about climate risk anything more than a year out, or they'll just want to stop insuring. You also mentioned about that we're giving people false incentives to rebuild in areas where maybe it's not safe. And so what can you draw from your experience with risky business and your insights? How do we use risk as a signal to help make good decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Dave Jones was also in the Wildfire Commission. So he was incredibly helpful in terms of thinking through those insurance proposals. I think I'm seeing insurers come to the table more than they were, partly because it's just now, it's partly a PR thing. I mean, they're going to become the villains if they stop insuring people, which is increasingly happening. But they're also trying to figure out, honestly, climate risk insurance policies. I mean, they're trying to find a market in this, which is interesting. So they're kind of at the table more than they were even 2 or 3 years ago. It's a really hard problem because there's a set of people that already live in these areas. And so what do you do with that set of people versus people moving in? And how do you do it in a way that's fair and doesn't create, which nobody wants to do, essentially a federal flood insurance program type model in California. So I think what I'm encouraged by is our Department of Insurance under Commissioner Lara is really continuing this work, and they're taking this all very seriously. They were partners of ours on the commission. They've been incredibly helpful. And I think we're trying to come up with ideas on this, but you're absolutely right. It's incredibly challenging because they do write annual policies. And so they can pull out on an annual basis if their risk looks like it's getting too high.
And I think part of the problem, it's great to have a market signal with a carbon price or an insurance price, but you don't necessarily make your decision of where you live based on the cost of energy or the cost of insurance. You might do it based on the schools or on, you can afford a house there or
well,
some
people
other
do. I mean, people.
kind of
That's
basis.
true. I mean, especially in California, where most people live in an earthquake risk zone of one kind or another. I mean, everybody here. I live in Berkeley. We all are on a fault line, right? And so you sort of have some deniability. It's like a compartmentalization in your head where you're like, I'm not going to think about that, but I probably shouldn't buy this house, but I'm going to do it anyway. But I do think we'd pay attention to some things, like when there's disclosure of, like if you're in a floodplain or if you're on a gas line or whatever. I mean, there's mandatory disclosure in real estate contracts, and we should be starting to think about climate risk disclosure for these acute risks. Mm-hmm. For the fire and flood side of the risk. I think it's harder with sea level rise for a variety of reasons, but it's something we need to be thinking about. And at the community scale, those chronic risks need to be part of general plans and specific plans.
So you're an incredible resource, and I want to open up the conversation to the floor. We have some mic runners. You can raise your hands. So if you have a question, please stand up, say your name, and try to keep your question or comment somewhat limited. So we have a limited amount of time left. Anybody have a comment or a question for Kate? Yes, right here.
And say who you are, please, because that would be helpful.
Nicola Pio-Molter from VMware. Can you give an example, with all the innovation that's going on around autonomous driving and some of the potentials for benefit or, like you were saying, nightmares, can you give examples of maybe policies where you're trying to drive those companies to do certain things like require 1.3 passengers per trip or something like that that might help us drive in the beneficial direction?
Yeah, I have to be honest with you. I struggle and am looking for help on this, frankly. I struggle with what the state can do past what we've done, which is sort of the general principles level, like how, and the, Caltrans is now doing their dividers on the highway wider because they're more easily seen by autonomous vehicles. So there's some like very specific, there's 6 inches, not 4 now. So there's some very specific, infrastructure things that we can do as a state on state-owned or maintained roads. And then there's some things we can do on principles. But I don't know how much, we struggle with this with housing too, right? A lot of this stuff is locally controlled. Or it's like the federal highway, like it's NHTSA or somebody, right? It's sort of, I struggle a little bit with like where our role is in what we can and can't mandate. We can do a certain amount on safety, but how do you think through safety in the autonomous vehicle context? I don't have a good answer for this question. So I think we're starting to look at it. Those principles are kind of being taken by our new transportation secretary, David Kim, who comes out of the auto industry and has a lot of, and then Federal Highway Administration before that has a lot of experience on these questions, is starting to think through that exact question. But this is a great time to engage on that because we don't know. We don't have good answers.
And before we get to the next question, a follow up on that. Yeah. I'm concerned about the Uber Air, let's just raise our congestion so that we have congestion from the ground up. Or how do we manage that dimension?
Yeah, that's a great, you probably know the statistic, but 25% of the vehicles in downtown San Francisco on any given workday are Ubers or Lyfts. So it has dramatically increased congestion. While being very convenient. And we sort of had this interesting moment where we thought that millennials were going to all not drive as much. And there was a dip in car ownership and in driving, and then all of a sudden it went way up again because of the...
the air service.
I'm sorry, the Uber Air, those guys, sorry, I was thinking.
So I'm just saying they're adding, they want to add a level of congestion.
Air, it will. And so that's another thing that we are trying to figure out. I just don't have a good answer for this question because we don't know. We have to figure out. It's sort of an uncharted world for everybody, right? We have to figure out where our jurisdiction is. We have to figure out how to work with locals. We have to figure out how to work with the companies. But the implications of doing stuff, this sort of, act now and break things and apologize later kind of theory doesn't really work very well in this space because there's real implications for safety. So I don't know the answer, but we probably will set up some kind of a task force of people who are experts. So please just engage on this because we really need you.
Thank you for joining us, Kate. I'm Amber Mace from the California Council on Science and Technology.
I know you well. Congratulations on your new job.
Thank you very much. And you just mentioned it, but can you and how this is so inherently local. Can you talk about your work in connecting with the local communities and the local city councils, and how do you do that? I mean, and do the local city councils and these local groups, do they have the information that they need? Do they have the resources they need? And how do you make those connections?
Yeah, we do. I mean, my office does a fair amount of that. We're not very big, but we do a fair amount of it. We do a lot of connection with planners and city managers in particular on the general plans. So we run the CEQA clearinghouse and we run the general plan guideline process. So we end up with a lot of connection to planners. And we do an annual planning survey that's really helpful in figuring out what people do and don't do and what they need and what resources they need. Through the Strategic Growth Council, where we disperse these huge amounts of money. We basically, just a quick primer on the budget. So the Cap and Trade program, I think everybody knows the Cap and Trade program. Cap and Trade program creates a set of revenues, which then go into this thing called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And the fund is divided out every year in the budget process. 20% of that fund is automatically given to the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program, which Strategic Growth Council runs. That program, again, we just gave away $400 million from that, probably will be $600 million next year. That program funnels money to affordable housing that is transit-oriented, that is walkable, bikeable. It's like it's a set of things. In that program, and also the Transformative Climate Communities program, which is a discretionary pot of money out of the same fund, it's entirely community driven. So those are, community, HSC, their community projects, the community folks get together, they do these very complicated application processes that make everybody come to the same table and agree on things. We give a lot of technical assistance and planning grants for that process. And Transformative Climate Communities is like very few projects that are very, very intensive, where we work consistently through the whole life of the project with folks. So lots of opportunities. Other agencies do a lot of technical assistance too. There is a real lack of capacity at the local level. One of the biggest challenges with California on planning and all the issues we just talked about, how you do autonomous vehicles at the local level, how you connect transit, is that we don't have a lot of local planners anymore. It used to be that they were funded almost entirely through the redevelopment agency and the redevelopment program, which is gone now, and there wasn't a replacement program to fund planners. So there are a number of transportation planners at the local level, many of whom are road builders. There are not a lot of people who are sort of integrated planners. And it's a big challenge that we see in the state. We're trying very hard to kind of redirect funding to make that a little bit easier, but it's really challenging.
Are there any questions from some of our younger people who are in the audience? Raise your hand.
Anybody really?
Want a mic and have a question? Don't be shy.
End of the day, you're all
yes, over here.
tired.
Make sure you get a mic. Great, thanks. And say your name.
Hi, my name's Matt Hood. Thank you for the talk, by the way. I just had a quick question, because I know a lot of the talk here has been focused on land use specifically, and I'm wondering sort of the trade-offs with land use and increasing our capacity of renewables, if that's factored into some of the longer-term planning at all, and if that's seen as a significant constraint to hit California's goals.
That's a really interesting question, and I will answer it, but I'll also use that opportunity to talk about something I should have talked about, which is in my world, this is my life because I have to think about fire all the time, so fire is connected to everything. And in this case, one of the things that happened when we had the bankruptcy, PG&E bankruptcy, was that the power purchase agreements that PG&E has signed are all in jeopardy, because a bankrupt entity in one of those contracts is a challenging situation, and a judge just said that they could be renegotiated, and it's very up in the air. So those power purchase agreements are very, very important to us meeting our goals. So that I should say the fire thing actually it's one of these areas where you think something's an adaptation issue, and then you're like, oh, it's actually a mitigation issue too, right? We can't actually do the thing if the contracts are at risk, or probably if everybody goes bankrupt, it will be hard to do as well. So that is a challenge. The land use question is an interesting question. I think you could probably argue it a number of ways. I would say that there's probably an argument for having more undeveloped land that could become land used for both, agriculture and wind, or agriculture and solar. We've seen that a lot, right? And so that might actually be helpful in terms of land use. Also, we could do a whole lot better job with distributed energy systems in the stuff we're building, right? We could just do better. I just had a really interesting meeting we get delegations all the time coming through, and I just met with the Dutch delegation, and I was like, what am I going to talk to them about? And then it turned out that they are really advanced on vehicle charging, and particularly vehicle to grid. So all of their new housing development is required to have vehicle to grid charging access, whether it's on the street or in the housing, in the parking, in the garages, which I think is kind of insane and amazing. And they use all of that so that the vehicles can become part of their power, meeting their renewable energy goals. You know, they're doing really cool stuff with like where people park for multiple days at a time and using those cars when they're plugged in. So their airport parking is all vehicle to grid, for instance. And I think that's really interesting. So you can do cool stuff with the built environment, right? That can actually help you to meet your goals beyond rooftop solar, which is sort of where everyone's head goes. And it's really important, but you can do a lot of other stuff with that. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I just think it has to be thought through ahead of time, right? We have to start, again, integrating both the resilience aspect and this mitigation aspect into how we're planning and building.
Yes, back here.
Hi, I'm Judy Bortz, and I'm with 350 Silicon Valley. We're an environmental group. I know that on the one hand, Governor Brown did a lot of good things for the environment, SB 100 being one of them. But he also accelerated and massively increased the amount of oil exploration in the state, and licenses were given, leases to do gobs and gobs more of oil drilling. Is Governor Newsom going to change that?
Let me first say that I do think that SB 4, which passed during the Brown administration and was very, very central on making a lot of drilling safer, was really important legislation and groundbreaking. So I just want to give a little bit of props to SB 4. But the second thing I'll say is that you'll see in the budget, the governor's thinking about this issue a lot. And it's not an easy issue, actually. Legally, the state was built, and the major development of the state was kind of grounded on oil when population started really going up in our economy. So we started going up, and a number of things are entrenched in law across a number of places in the state that are very challenging to unravel, and there's a lot of people looking into this. So it is something we talk about pretty much every day with the governor. The one thing that I think you should look at as a really positive sign is in the budget. This came directly from the governor. There is a study in the budget, a $1.5 million study that's a roadmap to get to carbon neutrality by 2045. It's under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund budget, and it puts Calif in charge of bringing a bunch of agencies together on this roadmap, and it specifically says to look not only at decline in demand, but decline in supply. And that's the first time we've actually said that in a document, and that study is going to be a place where we're going to sort of grapple with this issue and figure out how much of getting there is on the supply side and how and how to move forward. The other thing that's important in the budget that I am really proud of, because I worked on a piece of it before I came into the state, but the governor was personally invested in this as well. There's a big chunk of investment in workforce development in the budget under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and a piece of it is specifically these what are called high road training partnerships that bring employers, workers, community and workforce development folks and community folks together by region to figure out where the growth industries are and how to get there. And that piece specifically calls out aiming several of those partnerships at just transition strategies in areas that have been traditionally dependent on oil and gas. There are several places in the state, Kern County is an obvious one, but LA County is the second biggest producer in the state, that have large economic dependence on oil and gas. And so any strategy we have, frankly, whether it's because of market forces, our oil supply is going down already, whether it's because of automation, our oil jobs are going down already, or whether it's because of a global and California commitment to that transition, we have to get ahead of it so we don't have a situation like has been happening in West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, where we didn't get ahead of it, and it's a political nightmare as well as being, frankly, just a devastating problem for real people on the ground. So we're thinking about this stuff every day, and I can't give you a definitive answer for what he's going to do, but I will tell you he will do something.
So, Professor Benson.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your remarks.
Let people know who you are.
Sally Benson. So I was struck by your remark about a lack of capacity in planning. And I see a parallel to that in systems integration. largely. At the university, for every, $5 of research support we can get to, build a gadget or do whatever, we can get 50 cents for, systems kind of work. And I wonder, between systems and planning, does the state need to sort of think differently about trying to work with the academic organizations that are turning out these people so that, I see this huge growth in this need for systems thinking and systems tools. And is the state thinking about how it could help support the development of that capacity across the state?
That's a great question, I think, and a really good idea. We obviously think of academic partners as part of our resources, incredible resources in the state, and do a lot of work with those partners, and including a lot of sort of exchange kind of things with students, externships and things like that. But it's a really interesting idea. One thing that's encouraging to me is that the governor just got into the budget and got through the legislature a new Office of Digital Innovation, which is new for the state, and the legislature has appropriated 50 positions, which is actually enormous for a new department, in the governor's office. And I think the Office of Digital Innovation's whole job is going to be coming in with that kind of perspective. It's going to be coming in on a short-term basis across these agencies to say, we're not here to get entrenched and figure out procurement for the next 30 years. We're here to say, we are taking a high-level look at the system that you have now, and we're seeing where are the inefficiencies, where are the places where this could be better connected, where are there outside, where should be replaced, frankly, what can we learn from inside and outside. They're probably mostly going to be private sector people who run it. I would say it's similar to what happened after the sort of disastrous Obamacare rollout, when there was a whole group of folks that came in to sort of help figure that out. It's that's based on that model, or the Code for America model. And I think that's a place where we're going to see more attention paid to that question. And I think it'll be really interesting to see kind of what that results in. But it's kind of new. It's very much where the governor's head is. As you can imagine. I mean, he wrote a book about this kind of thing, so he cares about it. But I think that office is going to be an interesting place to look. And something, frankly, for students and others kind of interested in those issues, that office is going to be a really interesting sort of inside-outside game kind of place to work. And I think a really exciting opportunity.
We're going to need to start wrapping up this wonderful conversation. And I have a couple of thoughts, and I want to give you a chance to make closing remarks. One of the things that I've noticed, the state has tremendous resources like the Climate Adaptation Clearinghouse. How many people have heard of the Climate Adaptation Clearinghouse that the state of California has?
I'm frankly amazed it's that many.
Okay.
It's
well, that's fantastic. But one of the things I would like to encourage each person who's in this room to do is to become a spokesperson to go find out more about what the resources are. The state does not have a big investment in marketing and communications the way companies do. They don't really have a sales team, although it might be a good thing to do, so that they have all these fantastic resources that have been developed. You mentioned many of them in your talk today. And it's hard for people to find out about them. If planners are overworked, they're not reaching out to the state to find out what's available. The state doesn't have the mechanism to reach back and forth. So I think that's actually something that each of us can do to read some of the plans and the resources, and then to let people know about them. Write op-eds or blog, or talk to your city council members or your elected members or your companies, and let them know. So that I think each of us can take some effort, say, if we're trying to make systemic change, we can have some influence beyond what we might think by having these kinds of conversations and supporting our elected and the staff of our governments to be able to do the job that they're doing and to have more impact. Because I think part of our problem is the boundaries are not very permeable between our different institutions. So we have some great groups that bring science into the legislature, and there are many other people here who are doing interesting work, but we need to be telling these stories. The news media needs to think that this systemic change is newsworthy and not just a fire or murder or something else that's more sensational. So I think it's up to us to help tell a different story. And if you want to make just a closing remark about what story you want to leave people with, about what can all of us do to support you in being successful in the leadership you're providing. Just an additional comment, an observation, that I'm very impressed with the caliber of people that have come through the education system that taxpayers fund, as well as the private institutions like Stanford. And that makes our state really great, and I'm very grateful for the work that you do.
Thank you. It's really fun to do. And I should say, just a shout out. So I spent my last 2 years of high school here and went to Pali, and many of us in the administration went to Pali. So there is a whole contingent. So Catherine Lehman, who's the head of our legal team for the governor, Jason Elliott, who's the deputy cabinet secretary, me. There's just a bunch of Pali people running around. So kudos to the public education system in Palo Alto as well. I think, it's my days are completely insane in Sacramento, and I take the train from Berkeley every day, and which is great, actually. I know that sounds crazy, but it's great. I get a lot done. I prepare for the day on the train in the morning. I do my email. I catch up at the end of the day. Occasionally, I admit that I have a gin and tonic on the train on the way home. That's why we like the train rather than driving, right there. But it's insane because from the minute I arrive to the minute I leave, I'm in meetings. And many of those meetings are with people, outside folks, who are coming in with really critical information. And it's so helpful to me and to others in the state. Everything I just talked about is like 17 different issues, and I'm not an expert on any one of them. And so that integration of those issues, that systems thinking approach, is only possible if you have lots of smart people bringing you lots of bits of information that you can then tie together in this sort of web and then create a narrative that I go in and talk to the governor about, right? So I need all of that, and I really, as hard as it is, from a day-to-day basis, I really like it. And I just had folks from Stanford 2 weeks ago talking to me about fire prediction modeling in my office. I mean, it's very helpful to have those conversations, so that's great. I really agree with the point. I think, one of my favorite stories about Stanford, this is a little bit of a mean Stanford story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I'm sorry. It's not mean, but it's just indicative. Going to Berkeley, you just think about public service all the time, right? I mean, it's a very connected institution, as is Davis, to Sacramento and to policy, federal policy and state policy. I came to a conference down here when I was working for Tom Steyer in a prior life, and the conference, Jerry Brown was the keynote at the conference, and I was at the conference with him over in the Paul Brest Hall at the law school, and I walked across campus with him to whatever that fancy room is in the Hoover Library where you can have dinners, and not a single person recognized him walking across campus, and he's the governor of the state, right? So I was like, if this was Reid Hoffman, everybody would have recognized him, right? But it was just a moment, and so I will say, especially those of you affiliated with Stanford, this connection to policy is really important. And it's important not just because it's sort of a good works thing to do or public service thing to do. It's important because these issues that we're talking about are critically important to the state of California, not only to us as Californians, but also to our businesses and our ability to grow, our ability to recruit people, our ability to pursue innovative paths. And so just encouraging that connection, I think, is incredibly important. And we would love to see more folks from Stanford. I know it's far away, but there's ways to do it. We have a great executive fellows program that people can do the year after graduation of undergrad that's parallel. I mean, I would say it rivals the White House fellows program. It's really good. There's all kinds of ways you can get in, but this administration is super exciting to work for, doing great things, and just, don't think of it as a second or third or fifth choice just for do-gooders. Think of it as a really critical path forward to a better California.
Thank you, Kate.
Sure. Thank you.